Well, good evening, everyone. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and certainly let me thank my good friend Nick for extending the invitation for me to be present this evening and to speak with you about a real critical issue for people that I represent in the 8th Congressional District in Brooklyn and a little bit of Queens, but more significantly, a really critical issue for our great nation. And I'm thankful to Nick for his friendship and for his support over the years, certainly for his leadership here at the Vera Institute of Justice, which is a phenomenal engine for change in the social and criminal justice space. And we're thankful for Nick, we're thankful for all that you do. I'm so appreciative that so many of you would take the time to come out this evening. Think it not robbery just to spend a few moments talking about this issue of criminal justice reform. I thought I would spend some time just providing a little bit of an overview, relatively brief one, and then we can dive into the specifics with a robust question and answer period. It's been my honor to represent the people of the 8th Congressional District, which is, as I mentioned, largely anchored in Brooklyn, Fort Greene, and Clinton Hill, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, East New York, Canarsie, Coney Island. I even represent Howard Beach in Queens. Who knew? Someone named Hakeem Jeffries. One day represent Howard Beach. But it's a great opportunity that I've had to represent such a tremendously diverse district filled with hardworking people, also filled with communities. Of course, in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, parts of Bedford-Stuyvesant, East New York, the West End of Coney Island, where there have been individuals and families who've been devastated by the manner in which we've conducted criminal justice policy over several decades. I was sworn in on January 3rd of 2013. And then a few weeks after that, had the great privilege and honor to participate, at least be present, at the inauguration of Barack Obama, who of course was being sworn in for the second time as our nation's 44th president. And I was invited to be on the Capitol steps, of course, as a new member of Congress, but since the seating arrangements are determined based on seniority, I was seated with my fellow classmates way at the top. But I quickly realized that there was a tremendous advantage to sitting up top because you could see everything that was happening in front of you. And of course there was the president who was front and center, and the first family was there looking magnificent. The splendor of the American people, more than 1 million folks of different races, regions, and religions who would come to Washington to participate in this great democratic moment. But I'll never forget the fact that in close proximity to the president, I remember it as if it had just occurred yesterday, in close proximity to the president, there was arch-conservative Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. And next to Scalia, former Speaker John Boehner. And next to Boehner, current House Speaker Paul Ryan. And right next to those three, Jay-Z and Beyonce. What a great country we live in. You know, we've come a long way in the United States of America. But of course, we still have a long way to go. You know, put another way, Abraham Lincoln, about 150 years ago, a little more than that, publicly pondered the question, how do we create a more perfect union? And he, of course, asked that question in the context of the Civil War that was raging at the time, threatening to tear this nation apart. And we know that since that moment, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, we've made tremendous progress here in America. But of course, I still think it's relevant for us to consistently ask the question, how do we create a more perfect union? And I can stand here today as a member of the House, a member of the Judiciary Committee, and with some degree of confidence say that increasingly Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives, members of the House and members of the Senate, would answer that question at least in part by saying we've got to fix our nation's broken criminal justice system. Some of us might even go a little further and say we've got to end and bury once and for all the era of mass incarceration. Now we know in the early 1970s, in fact I think the approximate time might be 1971, when President Nixon declared a war on drugs, named drugs as public enemy #1. And for the last 44 or 45 years, we've been prosecuting a war. And yet we know that as we stand here in 2015, substance abuse hasn't been eradicated in America. In fact, in some instances, it's even gotten worse. But we have succeeded during that time period in ruining countless lives, countless families devastated, countless neighborhoods decimated, more than 2 million people incarcerated as we prosecuted a war on drugs that objectively has to be deemed a failure. And how do we find ourselves in this situation? I think it's instructive to figure out what the pathway has been to this point as we seek to unravel it and determine a better pathway forward. That's what some of us in Congress have endeavored to do, that we first have to understand the genesis of the problem before we can meaningfully resolve the situation. Now, Dwight Eisenhower, on his way out the door in 1960, warned the nation about the military-industrial complex and the perils of an industry becoming so powerful in nature that essentially it dictated what military spending would be, even when such spending was contrary to good public policy. Who could have predicted that you would also see the development of a parallel prison industrial complex that has many of the same characteristics? An industry and a way of thought that became so powerful in nature that it would dictate public policy even when that was inconsistent with the objectives it sought to accomplish. We know that here in New York State, as in many other parts of the country, when the textile mills shut down and the automobile plants were closed, when the steel mills were shuttered in many parts of upstate New York, that a decision was made by both Democrats and Republicans, this was a bipartisan thing, to replace those shuttered facilities with prisons. And in fact, this is something that we know occurred all across the country. And at the federal level in 1994, we made the problem worse, not better, by incentivizing and financing prison construction to the tune of almost $10 billion. Now, of course, when you build all these prisons, you didn't find yourself in an interesting situation because you've created some temporary jobs to build them, but now you've got to fill these prisons. Some would argue as part of a very perverse economic development strategy that had been created as the manufacturing jobs in this country in the 70s and in the 80s and into the 90s went overseas. I may be dating myself, but some of you are familiar, perhaps, with a movie that came out maybe about 20 or 25 years ago called Field of Dreams. Some of y'all just showed your age. But it was starring Kevin Costner. A lot younger then than he is now, one of my favorite actors. And Field of Dreams was about this idea of building a baseball stadium in the cornfields of Iowa. It's an idea that some people found peculiar because there were no baseball players around. But nonetheless, Costner and those who supported him decided we're going to move forward and build this baseball stadium under the theory, if you build it, they will come. And essentially what we've seen with prison construction in America is the notion that, yeah, we'll create some temporary jobs, but in terms of filling the prison cells, if we build it, they will come. And how do they bring that about? Well, we know here in New York that the engine that drove the prison industrial complex was the draconian Rockefeller drug laws. And of course, at the federal level, when we think about the growth of the prison industrial complex, the explosion of the incarcerated population, we know, of course, we've got 5% of the world's population. 25% of those incarcerated in the world are right here in the United States of America, more than any other country in God's green earth. And we know that the engine that helped to fuel this explosion, and at the federal level, was the imposition of harsh, mandatory minimums. First, in 1986, and then again, doubling down and tripling down in 1994 with the crime bill. Again, in a bipartisan way, Democrats and Republicans. Some perhaps fueled by the notion of the prison industry as an economic substitute for economically deprived communities throughout rural America. Others, perhaps, Democrats and Republicans, driven by the notion that to build prisons and to develop a notion of us locking people up and throwing away the key was good politics, to be a law and order elected official. And so we find ourselves now in a situation where, when the war on drugs was started in 1971, prison population hovered around 300,000, and now, of course, it's 2.3 million. And at the federal level, and this struck me, where you've got a system that you think of as one that is reserved in large measure for drug kingpins or hardcore gangbangers, individuals convicted of violent acts of terror, mafia dons, or people who participate in organized crime. Many of you may be surprised to learn that in the federal system, roughly 50% of the people who are there serving right now are there for nonviolent drug offenses. 50%. About 40% of the folks are there for so-called administrative and or public order offenses. And only about 10% of the folks who are incarcerated in our federal system right now were convicted of a violent felony. 1 out of every 10 of just over 200,000 people. Something has gone wrong in our criminal justice system. And so we've endeavored to begin to fix it, and the work didn't just start in 2015. The first meaningful step, I would posit, occurred in 2010, when the disparity between a conviction for crack cocaine and a conviction involving powder cocaine was reduced from 100 to 1 to where it is right now, 18 to 1. which was a significant step in the right direction. There's probably no reasonable argument for there to be any disparity whatsoever, because there's no pharmacological difference between the two forms of cocaine. No pharmacological difference. I've always wanted to use that word. I can't spell it, but I know what it means. No pharmacological difference. So now we've got an 18-to-1 disparity. That was the first step. It wasn't, however, made retroactive. And now we've arrived at another moment of opportunity, where two bills have been introduced and are currently before the House of Representatives, the Judiciary Committee that I serve on, for consideration. One of them is the Safe Justice Act, and that's more far-reaching. And we can talk more about sort of the contours of this bill, but it would do several important things, all designed to reduce mass incarceration. It would effectively eliminate mandatory minimums at the 5- and the 10-year level for every offender, with the exception of leaders of a drug organization. And when you think about the use of mandatory minimums, if they have any currency or value, I'm not convinced. But it's reasonable to suggest that if they've got any currency or value, it should be reserved for those at the top of a drug organization, and not individuals who may have casually been involved or simply been at the wrong place at the wrong time as a girlfriend or a wife or a brother or a sister, and found themselves going away to federal prison for 5 years, for 10 years, for 15 years, simply because of the harshness of what was put into place back in 1986 and in 1994. The bill will also take the reduction in disparity between powder and crack cocaine that was done in 2010 and make it retroactive. The will didn't exist apparently in 2010 to get that done, but in the intervening 5 years, we've now concluded, Democrats and Republicans, even law and order members of the institution, that it's simply unfair, having statutorily acknowledged that 100-to-1 was not justified and was outrageous, to have people sitting in federal prison right now who would be out had they been sentenced under the 18-to-1 current statutory framework. And if that goes into effect, thousands of people will be able to get out the day that provision is signed into law. It would also take the provision of compassionate release, which is currently only available to people who are 60 years or older and have really aged out of criminal activity. Though it's a provision that is not as utilized as it should be. And it's also presently available to folks who may have a serious medical ailment, most often terminally ill. And it would extend it, with judicial discretion, to individuals who have children on the outside whose primary caregiver has passed away or become incapable of providing for the well-being of that child. This will be particularly important to some communities in America. The African American community, we know there are more than 1 million children right now who've got a father incarcerated somewhere in America. And so incarceration has had a devastating effect, we know, on families. Compassionate release provision and its expansion would be designed to deal with that dynamic. It also would increase the flexibility for folks to be able to get out of their incarceration sentence earlier than what they may be able to do right now. That is the Safe Justice Act, and it's been introduced by Jim Sensenbrenner, who's a former chairman of the Judiciary Committee and a Republican from Wisconsin, and Bobby Scott, who is a prominent Democrat on these issues from down in Newport News, Virginia. And I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of that legislation. And then there's a more modest bill that's been introduced by Chairman Goodlatte of the Judiciary Committee and John Conyers, who's the lead Democrat and a tremendous voice for justice over the years, as the top Democrat on the legislation. And the bill, as I indicated, is far more modest in its provisions. Now, it would deal with the retroactivity of the crack cocaine disparity. And so it would also stand to help thousands of individuals who are currently incarcerated right now. The concern that many of us have is that it does not go as far as we think it should be going in terms of reducing mandatory minimums that are currently on the books. And in fact, it would add a mandatory minimum of up to 5 years if a defendant was convicted of involvement in drug activity connected to certain forms of heroin. And it would add 2 other mandatory minimums that are rarely used by federal prosecutors. One as it relates to interstate domestic violence activity, and the other related to the importation of arms connected to acts of terrorism. Mandatory minimums that were added at the insistence of some Republicans, as I understand it, in the Senate. But those are the 2 bills that are standing before us right now. And the question that those of us on the Judiciary Committee have got to consider, the ideal version would be to move forward with the Safe Justice Act. It's unclear right now, however, whether the will exists amongst the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and enough members on both sides of the aisle to move forward with the more substantial piece of legislation that would also seek to reinvest some of the savings of a decline in incarceration into proactive programs designed to prevent people from getting into trouble in the first place. Or are we at a moment where it's appropriate to make some progress on the issue, knowing that the House is Republican controlled and the Senate is Republican controlled? And the fact that we're even having this meaningful conversation about dealing with sentencing reform in and of itself shows how far we've come as a country and as a Congress since the war on drugs was started in 1971. And so we can get further into that discussion as it relates to how we move forward on sentencing reform at this moment in time, and the value of compromise at a moment where at least progressives aren't in the numerical majority in Congress. But I thought I would end by just reflecting upon the notion of whether Congress or whether the people that we represent can collectively be thought to meet the challenges of the day as we see it in 2015. And many have said to me, well, the House is broken and the Senate is broken, it's dysfunctional, and certainly there are times when even I look at the situation and say, there's some folks down here who really need adult supervision. You know, some folks who need to be put in the timeout corner. We've got serious issues with some on the extreme within the institution. But there's also opportunity, as been demonstrated all throughout the history of this country, as we've continued this march toward a more perfect union, to take steps necessary to perfect and improve upon our democracy. I'm reminded of the time that a few young folks had been gathered at the house, the estate, I should say, of one of the wealthiest people in the world. And they were gathered at this estate, and at the estate there's a lake on one side of the lake. They're at on the other side of the lake. The owner of the estate shows up, and he sees these young men on the other side, and he calls over to them. He says, if any of you are willing to jump in this lake where there are crocodiles and alligators, and in the middle of the lake there's one small turtle. If any of you are willing to jump in this lake, can rescue the turtle, and make it to the other side, I'll give you anything that you want in this world. About 5 minutes pass by, and none of the young men respond. So the owner of the estate, he turns around and he begins to walk away. As soon as he's walking away, he hears a big splash. Turns back around and he sees one young man in the lake, frantically trying to make it to the other side. And somehow this young man makes it to the middle. He scoops up the turtle, dodges some crocodiles, dodges some alligators, makes it to the other side, gets out, dries himself off, and hands over the turtle. And the owner of the estate looks at him and he says, I don't know how you did it, but congratulations. Now, as I said, you can have anything that you want in this world. And the young man paused for a moment, looked at the owner and said, well, I just want to know who pushed me in the lake. What am I trying to say? Sometimes you find yourself unexpectedly in a tough spot. And when you're in that tough spot, you really only have two options. You can either sink or you can swim. And if you look at the long arc of history here in the United States of America, whenever we found ourselves in a tough spot, whether it was the Civil War, or the Great Depression, or World War II, or the Civil Rights Jim Crow era, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, or right here in New York City in the aftermath of 9/11, whenever we have found ourselves in a tough spot, America has figured out a way to make it to the other side. And so we confront this dynamic of an explosion of the prison population. Who would have thought that we would ever be at a moment where we can deal with mass incarceration in America with Democrats and Republicans coming together? Decades late, but not inconsistent with America's long, majestic, and continuous march toward a more perfect union. And I'm just glad to be a part of it and look forward to working with you to get prison reform to the other side. Thank you very much.